Okay, welcome to chapter 19. This is the nervous system for anatomy and physiology. So let's just jump right in. The nervous system, what does it do? A lot. Coordinates and responds to all kinds of stimuli, internal and external. And it's responsible for really almost all of the communication internally between your body systems. It works with the endocrine system, right? And it's got a major influence on all the other body systems as well. Gets information from the outside world. Think about it. Your nervous system is in charge of sensory information, things you see, things you smell, things you hear, things you taste, and things you touch, right? And it is constantly adjusting to whatever your environment is to make sure that you stay in homeostasis. And neurology is the study of the nervous system. Let me just highlight that, okay? So what is the structure and function of it? So the biggest function is communication. It takes in communication from external stimuli, and it also takes in communication from internal stimuli and then responds to things like danger, pain. So it's just like if you go near something that's really hot, like a stove that's still hot, your hand will instinctively pull away not to get burned. And again, it helps maintain homeostasis, keeps your body in equilibrium. And there's a lot we don't even know about it. You know, we have conscious thoughts, but we have unconscious thoughts that we're sometimes even unaware of. How do we learn? How do we process new information, right? How do we keep our memories in our brain? How do we have judgment and reason and make decisions about things? All of this is from the nervous system, right? So communication is one, control. The nervous system basically directs everything that our body does. It maintains our blood pressure, respirations, heart rate, and other vital functions. That's right at the brainstem. Regulates body systems, temperatures, coordinates reflexes, controls instinctual behavior. So there are parts of our brain that are like the primal brain and the mammalian brain. And our evolved brain will help us control some behaviors that may not be appropriate in this day and age. Controls conscious movement, right? We can move because of our nervous system, and unconscious thoughts. So there's a lot of function with the nervous system. So the cells of the nervous system are called neurons, okay? Neurons are a little different than other cells in the body. Okay. Their functions are thinking, memory, and regulation of pain and tactile stimulation and other organs and that kind of thing. Why is the cell of the neuron different? It only has one cell body, but it's got two processes, axon and dendrites. And they're microscopic, but some of them are big and some of them are small. And it takes multiple neurons to make up a nerve. If a nerve cell body gets destroyed, it's a wrap. It does not rejuvenate. So let's take a look at a nerve cell. This is a nerve cell. Looks different than other cells, right? So this is the base of the cell body with the dendrites, those finger-like apparatus that are coming out of there. There's the nucleus, which is the brain of the cell right in the middle. Okay? And then you have the branches of the axons that are covered with a myelin sheath. These branches of the axon communicate with things like muscles. For example, if I want to lift my arm, there has to be an impulse sent all the way down to the junctions, the neuromuscular junctions, where there's a chemical acetylcholine there that helps the communication go between the nerve and the muscle, and then my muscle moves. Okay, so it is complicated. And again, these are all different sizes within your body, depending on where they are in your body. If we take this even more microscopically and look at the myelinated sheath, we can look at the layers of the sheath, right? You don't really need to know the layers of the sheath, so I'm not going to ask any questions about that. But the axon is actually in the middle of this myelin sheath, and then all of these axons are enclosed in these fascicles that are in this whole enclosure here, right, in the nerve. So, and you need all of them to innervate different parts of the body, whether it's the arms or the legs or whatever. A synapse is a junction between the nerve cell and whatever it's communicating with. Okay. So if this is the axon, right? And there are the branches of the axon, and this is a muscle fiber here, okay? The nerve junctions, the synapses are here. The synapses are where the axon branches touch the muscle or whatever they're trying to communicate with. And then the neurotransmitter, which for muscles is acetylcholine, is embellished all through here, so that when that little axon actually touches the muscle, it makes a connection with the help of that acetylcholine to make that muscle move. It's really a complex system that goes on there. It's pretty amazing. So we can classify our neurons, nerve cells, depending on what they do. So we have sensory neurons. And by the way, these things you need to know. Sensory neurons, also known as afferent neurons, they're the ones that are, say, in your hands. So when you touch something, sends a signal to the brain and you know what you're touching. Like if I touch my eyeglasses, my brain goes, oh, you're holding your eyeglasses, right? So they're the sensory neurons. Motor neurons or efferent neurons, they're the ones that get messages from the brain, the central nervous system, and send the messages to the muscles, say, if I want to lift my arms or walk or run or whatever. They're the ones that make you able to have movement. And then you have interneurons. They're kind of like the bridges or the connectors between the sensory and the motor. And they basically integrate the signals so that they don't get screwed up or confused, right? So neuroglia in your central nervous system is they're part of the tissue in the brain, and it's composed of different types of cells. You've got astrocytes, right? And the astrocytes give nutrients to the neurons, and they form part of this blood-brain barrier. And I do want to talk about that briefly. It's kind of almost an imaginary wall around the brain, and it keeps bad things out. It's like Donald Trump's wall. It only lets certain things in, tries to keep harmful materials out of the brain to protect the brain. It does have one inherent flaw. It lets ammonia cross over, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit and why that's a problem. Okay, so astrocytes, they supply nutrients to the neurons, and they're part of what makes up the blood-brain barrier. Microglia, they are phagocytes, which are kind of a white blood cell. So if there's any pathogens or microorganisms that are in there trying to get to our nerve cells, microglia will ingest them. It's like Pac-Man. It'll eat them up, right? We have oligodendrocytes, which they're kind of like insulation around the axons. And then we have ependymal cells, which form the lining of the brain's ventricles, and they help to make cerebral spinal fluid, which is what CSF stands for. And I'm going to actually type that in here. Cerebrospinal fluid, which is kind of a lubricant, if you will, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, okay? All right. So in the neuroglia, there's also different types of cells in the peripheral nervous system. You have satellite cells and Schwann cells. They're the ones that help make that cerebrospinal fluid and the myelin sheath that kind of protects the axons of the nerves. They help obtain nutrients. They insulate, like I said, the neurons keep them in place. They get rid of pathogens, and any of the dead nerve cells, they get rid of them. They're like the housekeepers. Okay, kind of, sort of. So here is a cross section of someone's head, and it gives you an idea about the covering over the brain and the spinal cord called the meninges or the meningeal covering. Okay, you have the brain here, right? And this is the brain stem, which goes to the spinal cord, which is inside the spinal column, okay? Around the spinal column, you have your vertebrae. Here, you can see those. But all around the spinal column, see this blue that goes all the way around? That is where the cerebrospinal fluid is, okay? So that kind of keeps everything lubricated and protected and safe. Okay, so it's in between, like here's a little microscopic cross section. Here's the skull. You've got your dura mater, arachnoid mater, your pia mater, your blood vessels. And these, the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater, the three maters make up the meninges. Okay? So just know that the meninges are just a layer around the brain and the spinal column for protection and lubrication. Okay? They contain cerebrospinal fluid. Question, is the following statement true or false? Infants and small children have slower reflexes than adults. If you said true, you would have been right because they're still developing the nervous system, right? So they're not going to be as quick. And there are reflexes that babies have that we better not have, okay? And since they're naming them, I'll just tell you for fun. The Moreau reflex, also called the startle reflex, is when you make a loud sound near a baby and both of its arms will go back and its little mouth will open like it's shocked. That's the Moreau reflex. The rooting reflex is where they're looking for milk, looking for a nipple, right? The Babinski reflex is when you take either your finger or maybe your pen and on the infant's foot at the medial aspect of the heel, and you go upwards between the great toe and the second toe, and all of the baby's toes will fan out. That's the Babinski. And then the stepping reflex. If you hold a newborn baby up under its arms in an upright position and let its feet touch the ground or a table, it's going to try to step, even though it can't bear weight, but it's going to try. That's a stepping reflex. All of these reflexes disappear. These four specifically will disappear by the time the child's like 6 months old, give or take. Okay. If they're present in an adult, that's a bad sign. Traumatic brain injury or something's wrong. Okay, so let's talk about the nervous system and how it gets divided up. You've got your central nervous system, that's your brain and spinal cord. And then all the other nerves, the peripheral nervous system, which includes your cranial nerves and your spinal nerves. And then there's one more subdivision, which is the autonomic nervous system. And just think of autonomic as like automatic, right? It does things that you can't control. And in the autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division, okay? So here's a picture of the brain. We'll start with the brain, okay? These are the lobes of the brain. If you look here, this is the pons, right? The medulla oblongata. This is the cerebellum. Right in here, pretty much, is where all of your respiratory center, your cardiac center, and your blood pressure center is. This controls those involuntary things, keeping your heart beating, keeping you breathing, etc. Okay? But then the different areas of the brain have to do with different types of actions and thoughts. So now we can look at it this way. When we look at this, the functional areas of the brain, okay? On the left side of your head, only on the left side, right in here is Broca's area. And that is your motor speech area. That gives you the ability to form words with your lips and your mouth. Okay? And then up in here is your ability to write things down. Okay? Here in the prefrontal area are higher level things, intellectual activities. It has to do with impulse control, controlling emotion, reason, logic, and judgment, prefrontal, okay? If we look at here, this yellow part, this is the auditory receiving, and then the auditory interpretation. Auditory receiving, or ears don't hear. Your brain is what hears. Your ears just funnel the sounds into the brain. And then this receives those sounds. And then this part of the brain goes, oh, those are church bells. Or, oh, that's your favorite song. That's the interpretation area. And then this little piece right here is the olfactory bulb. That's what allows us to smell. Our nose doesn't smell, our brain smells. But the nose just gathers those scents, sends them up to the brain, and the brain interprets them. Back here, we have the area that allows us to read. And back here, this whole back portion, occipitally, is the visual receiving and interpretation area. So what we see with our eyes, we don't really see with our eyes, we see with our brain. But the eyes send the signals to that part of the brain, which receive the signals and then interpret them at the speed of, faster than the speed of light, really. Right? We have our ability to taste embedded right around here. And then right in here has to do with pain, touch, pressure, somatosensory cortex, tactile. When you touch something, you can feel what it is. And then this green area here, primary motor cortex, that's voluntary movement, gives us the ability, when I think I want to stand up, I stand up. And the premotor cortex is all about our coordination. So I may be able to stand up, but do I fall down when I stand up? Or am I able to be coordinated and walk or dance or run? So that's this part of the brain. Okay, pretty amazing, pretty amazing. I just threw this in for people that have problems with alcohol. They do really, really significant damage to their liver. And the liver is supposed to excrete ammonia. When the liver's damaged and it can't excrete ammonia, the ammonia goes back into the blood. And that is the problem with that blood-brain barrier that we talked about earlier. I said there was one thing about it that was an inherent flaw. That's the flaw. It will let ammonia cross over into the brain. And when ammonia crosses into the brain, you have encephalopathy. We'll just look at the word encephalo, brain. Pathy or pathos means it's sick, it's not right, it's not working right. Encephalopathy. Wernicke's encephalopathy, brain's not working right at Wernicke's area particularly. And that's the area that has to do with, if you look, understanding things, understanding like higher function, understanding when people are talking to you. And these are all kinds of symptoms of thiamine deficiency or Wernicke syndrome. Really, really bad. So they present as if they're a very, very end stage dementia patient with this disorder. Okay, now let's look at the brain and pick it apart. We have three major divisions: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and then the medulla oblongata. Okay, the cerebrum, like we just talked about, I showed you what the cerebrum does. It's really about sensory data, motor function, intelligence, reasoning, higher level behavior, complicated, reasoning and those kinds of things, and learning and memory. So that the cerebrum handles all those things. So just know that the cerebrum handles these things: sensory data. I'm going to highlight these: motor functioning, right? Intelligence, reasoning, learning, and other complex behaviors, right? That's what the cerebrum does. Then we have the cerebral cortex. So that's kind of gray matter. There's gray matter and there's white matter in the brain. But you don't need to know that. But anyway, the cerebral cortex is divided up into 4 lobes. You have your frontal lobe right in the front of your head, like your forehead. That's written and motor speech, higher levels of functioning, impulse control, right? That kind of stuff. The parietal lobe, the sensory area, and spatial ability. Spatial ability, if you're driving your car and you need to fit into a parking spot, how can you tell if you can fit your car in that spot? The parietal lobe, okay? The temporal lobe, all about receiving and interpreting auditory signals, sounds, processes language. Your special senses stores memories. And then your occipital lobe in the back of the head, vision, all about vision, receiving transmissions and then interpreting what they are. Okay. I'm not going to talk about the white matter. Not really. It's important, but we don't need to break it down that much. The cerebral hemispheres, hemi meaning half, sphere meaning a circle. So half of the circle of the cerebrum. The right side, and we know now that this may not even be absolutely correct, but I'm going to let the book be the guide. So the right side controls your muscles, receives sensory information from the left side of the body. Okay. Also relates to spatial perception, art, music. Okay. The left side of the cerebrum, which is the left cerebral hemisphere, has to do with analytic and verbal skills, your ability to walk, right? And it controls the right side of the body. And then the corpus callosum allows those two hemispheres to talk to each other. It's like the facilitator in between the right and the left. So if someone has a right-sided stroke, they will have problems on the left side of their body. And vice versa. If they have a left-sided stroke, left side of the brain, they're going to have the residual deficits on the right side of the body. Okay. All right. The diencephalon then this one is important. This is what contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the metathalamus, and the epithalamus. Don't worry about all of those, but the one that's important here is the hypothalamus. That is a very important endocrine gland. Really, come on, buddy, let's go. There we go. And it works hand in hand with our pituitary gland. And we'll talk about that in another portion of this. Then we have the thalamus, which is basically the relay point for all the incoming nerve messages from the body. So when you're feeling something, when you're feeling sensations, it kind of integrates them to the brain so that you can have the whole experience. Let's say you went to the spa and you have your feet soaking and you're getting a massage. All those things that are happening at once, all those senses go through the thalamus and they're integrated. That's like the central command post for all the incoming sensory nerve messages. Okay. Pretty crazy. And then the hypothalamus. Why is that important? Hypothalamus works hand in hand with your pituitary gland and it regulates homeostasis. It keeps all your deep visceral activities, in other words, your deep organs moving the way they're supposed to. It increases or decreases body functions like metabolism, and it stimulates certain hormones to be released from the pituitary. The way I describe the endocrine system is that the pituitary gland is the king or the father, and the hypothalamus is the queen or the mother. The father's in control, but not really, because he can't do anything without the hypothalamus giving him the okay. So that's one way to remember it. It controls your body temperature, the balance of water in your body, how much you sleep, your hunger, your sexual desires, your emotions. That hypothalamus is important. And it's the major bridge or link between your nervous system and your endocrine system. And that is super important to know. And this will all come in handy in med-surg when we get to endocrine. Okay? All right, there's the brain. And again, that's a side view. Cerebrum, the diencephalon, right? There's your thalamus, your hypothalamus. Right here is the pineal gland. That's what makes melatonin, the pineal gland, so you can sleep. And then right there is your pituitary, right? Big deal. And here's your brainstem, right? The midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata, which controls respirations, heart rate, blood pressure. Like if you get a severed spinal cord here, you're dead. When someone hangs themselves, that's what they're hoping to break their neck at this level so that this cuts off and then there's no communication between the brain and the body, so you're dead. And then this is very interesting. This is the limbic system. It's all about your emotions, right? It maintains your awareness, your emotions. Things like the hippocampus and the reticular formation are in there. Your hippocampus is how you learn and how you keep memories. Your reticular formation that's the thing that's the kind of the gatekeeper that lets sensory input into your cerebral cortex, and it governs wakefulness and sleeping. And then your cingulated gyrus coordinates smells and sights with memories. Do you ever smell something and it immediately triggers a memory of something or someone that smelled like that? It's a very strong sensation, right? And all these things are part of the limbic system. That's really our emotional headquarters, okay? And that's important to know, the limbic system. The cerebellum, that's the second largest part of the brain, and it's concerned with functions like movement. It's big on movement, posture, equilibrium, muscle tone, coordination. Can you walk? Can you run? Can you dance? Can you jump? All those things. And it coordinates voluntary muscles and adjusts when it gets impulses from what are called proprioceptors. In other words, if there's some external stimuli that, like if we're jumping and maybe we're going to get ready to jump on some hot coals, is the minute you get near the coals, it's going to send a signal like, don't do it, right? To kind of protect you. It helps you keep your balance and make coordinated movements. When you see people with, say, Parkinson's disease, they have problems with their gait, with balance, those kinds of things, okay? And that's part of the brain that's affected, cerebellum. And then the brainstem, like I said, the brainstem is the control center, right? It connects the cerebral hemispheres with the spinal cord, and it's where the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata are. The midbrain is all about reflexes, involuntary reflexes, visual reflexes, auditory reflexes, writing reflexes, and red nucleus is involved with motor function. When we talk about visual reflexes, if I shine a light into your eye, your pupil will constrict, right? That's a reflex because it's too much light and the pupil constricts to not damage what's behind the pupil, right? The retina and the cornea. So that's a visual reflex. An auditory reflex, if you're at a concert, right, and you're listening to super, super loud music, you may get a ringing in your ear, and you might put your hands over your ears. That's kind of a reflex to protect your ears. And then a vital reflex, the involuntary reaction center, that's really the one that's the protective reflex. Back to that, if the stove is still hot and as you reach towards it and your body feels the heat, you're going to involuntarily pull your hand away, right? The writing reflex, and you don't need to know these, but these are fun to talk about, so I am telling you about them. The writing reflex is if you're falling, do you have enough balance to kind of land on your feet, right? And then the red nucleus in the midbrain is involved with motor function, your ability to walk versus jog versus run, versus dance versus skip, and all those fun things. All right, continuing on, we got the pons, and the pons contains the tracts that carry messages between the cerebrum and the medulla, and that's where the respiratory center is, right? If that's damaged, you ain't breathing. The medulla oblongata attaches directly to the spinal cord, and that's where the one I was talking about when I showed you guys that picture of the brain earlier, if that's damaged, you're dead, because that's making your heart beat, it's making you breathe, and it's keeping your blood pressure going. So that's, if any injury to that, you're done. The spinal cord is just a long mass of nerve cells and fibers. Don't worry about the horns. It's got ascending and descending tracts for the different nerves, sensory or motor nerves, right? And it's located inside the spinal column. What does it do? It conducts impulses either to the brain or from the brain, and it acts as a reflex center to help. It's like a protective mechanism, okay? So here you go, reflexes. Here they're showing you a deep tendon patellar reflex, which is right there at the knee. So when the doctor takes the little hammer, boop, and taps right there, the leg should kick a little bit. Why? Because when it's hitting this nerve, there's a receptor here that sends faster than the speed of light. That signal goes here and says, up, it's going to kick, boom, boom, kick. Right? That's how it was. I mean, it's so fast, it's mind-boggling, really. It's amazing. And then accessory structures of the nervous system. The meninges, which I kind of already talked about, they're those protective layers or membranes that protect the brain and the spinal column and cord, right? It's the dura mater, the arachnoid membrane, and the pia mater, the maters. And the cerebrospinal fluid that is inside the meninges. And I'm going to give you a fun fact. Cerebrospinal fluid, and I'm going to put this in parentheses, contains glucose. And you'll understand somewhere down the road why that's so important. So the cerebrospinal fluid removes cellular waste from your nerve tissue, right? And if you have any kind of a traumatic, like a car accident, it's like a cushion or a shock absorber for your spinal column and cord. And we already talked about where it gets produced. You don't need to know that, though. I'm going to unhighlight that. Okay, that's not that important. And I'm not going to go into the ventricles in the brain, but there's little cavities within the brain. That's it for the brain. Now, the nervous system, peripheral nervous system. That's not the brain and spinal cord, but everything else. Okay? So, but it all comes from your spinal cord and all connects to the brain. So just bundles of neurons that connect the brain and the spinal cord to the rest of the body. You've got the nerves broken down into two groups, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Stop it, honey. So stop, honey. The cranial nerve, my dog is driving me nuts. The cranial nerves, there are 12. They start in the brain. And I'm going to go over them and I'm going to teach you a mnemonic device so you can remember what they are, the cranial nerves. And then the spinal nerves originate from your spinal cord, and they are the ones that innervate and sense everywhere in your body, from your fingers and your hands down to your toes and your feet and everywhere in between. Okay. And then again, they have afferent or efferent types of nerve cells, right? And so nerve fibers, they're either receiving information or they're sending information. But then there's one additional kind of cell or kind of tissue that's made up of nerve cells, extrapyramidal and pyramidal. And this is going to be important when we get to mental health. They're kind of mixed nerves. So they're kind of afferent and they're kind of efferent, little bit of both, kind of, sort of. Again, when we get to mental health, this is all going to make perfect sense, but just understand that you've got your cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The nerves are either sensory or motor, right? But then there's that one extra category, pyramidal, extrapyramidal. They're like mixed nuts. Okay. Here are the cranial nerves. Okay. This is the way I remember them. I was taught this in nursing school 30 some odd years ago. If you look at the first letter of each of the nerves, on old Olympus, towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. And that's how I remembered the cranial nerves. So let's go back to the first one. Cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory or sense of smell. 2 is the optic nerve for your actual vision. So seeing things to the brain. 3 is oculomotor. That's the ability of the eye to move. 4 is trochlear. Those are the voluntary eye movements. 5 is trigeminal. It's the sensations of your head and face, moving your jaw, your mandible. 6 is your abducens, which is your eye movements. There's a lot of these cranial nerves have to do with the eyes. 7 is your facial nerve, and that allows you to like raise your eyebrows and look surprised and taste things. 8 is your acoustic. It's also called the vestibulocochlear nerve, and that has to do with your hearing and your balance. 9 is the glossopharyngeal. When you see glosso, that's tongue. So that's how you swallow, right? And it gives information on pressure and oxygen tension of your blood and your taste buds also. 10 is your vagus nerve, not like Viva Las Vegas. Your vagus nerve is the biggest nerve in the body. This nerve literally runs from the brain all the way down to your anus, okay? And it has to do with all these somatic motor functions and some parasympathetic functions. Has to do with your speech, your ability to swallow, your gag reflex, which protects you from choking. And if it's stimulated in the rectum anus area, you can sometimes, what they call vagal down. There will be a precipitous drop in heart rate and blood pressure. People can pass out. So, and we'll talk more about that later. Number 11 is your spinal or accessory nerve, and that allows you to raise your shoulders, like shrug your shoulders and move your head. And then 12 is your hypoglossal, which allows you to stick out your tongue and yada, yada. Okay. So, and I can't believe that they even have my mnemonic in here. That's the one that I learned. And there it is. So for your enjoyment, you can look at that later. The 12th cranial nerve, who remembers? It is, movement of the tongue. Let you move your tongue. Okay. Now your spinal nerves, you don't need to know all of these, okay? How many pairs there are, et cetera, and the dorsal root ganglion and the plexus. You don't need to know that, but I'll tell you what you do need to know. If there's an injury to your spinal cord, okay, one of two things can happen. It can either be a temporary paralysis because there's swelling and inflammation, or it can be a permanent paralysis. Think about someone who's a paraplegic or a quadriplegic, okay? If a transection occurs, in other words, if there is a cutoff at some point in that spinal cord, anything below that cutoff is dead, right? The nerves cannot regenerate. And again, like I said earlier, if that injury is up here at the junction where the brain and the spinal cord meet at the medulla, you're going to die. Okay. I threw in a picture of dermatomes so you can see the nerves emanating from the spine, and they control your arms and your back and your hands and your feet and everything. Okay. Here's another question. Is the following statement true or false? The nerve fibers of the spinal cord quickly regenerate after an injury. No, they do not. We just said that. That's why you got to protect that spinal cord. They do not. Once they're dead, they're dead. Here is a flow chart that organizes the nervous system. So sensory nervous system, how you feel things, goes to your central nervous system. And then the motor or the efferent, right, goes to the sympathetic or the autonomic, right? And the autonomic is sympathetic or parasympathetic. And I do want to talk about that a little bit. Here we go. It is in here. So the autonomic nervous system, think automatic, right? There's nothing that you do. It's on its own. It's completely independent. And the two divisions are sympathetic and parasympathetic. And that's what we call fight or flight. So if you get nervous or anxious about anything, our primal brain goes into that sympathetic division and initiates this fight or flight response. It will pour norepinephrine through your body, and that basically draws blood flow away from your digestive tract and to your arms and legs in case you have to fight or run, and to your eyes so that your pupils will dilate to get more light in so you can see what's out there threatening you. Once it's used up, then the parasympathetic division will kick in. And that's the relaxation part of it. That's where everything kind of goes back to normal equilibrium. So it's the opposite of the sympathetic. Okay, they also call it the letdown. So when you go in to take a test, if you get anxious and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in with that fight or flight, it's going to be very hard to concentrate. That's why I always tell students, if you feel that happening, you have to burn off that norepinephrine before you sit down or you won't do well on the test. Okay, it's important. There's kind of a diagram of the autonomic nervous system and all the things that it affects. The transmission of nerve impulses. So I'm not going to get into, all of it, but I'm going to try to make this as short and sweet and easy to understand as possible, okay? So there are pathways. When you touch something, if something is hot or something is cold, the message from that touch has to go through a pathway to get to the brain, let's say, right? In order for you to interpret what the message is. So there's a resting potential, which is the difference between the charge inside and outside of a cell, movement of potassium and sodium, muscle, right? The nerve impulse is the stimulus, like whatever you touched or felt, active transport, and then the refractory period. So let's see if we can make this easy to understand. It's like, what route do you take to drive to school, right? There is a certain route that's the best way or the easiest way to go, where it allows for your car to get where you're going in the easiest, quickest way possible. That's the nerve pathways. So they can only take one stimulus at a time to innervate the nerves. So think about if you get multiple stimuli, if you've ever seen anybody with Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis that has tremors, tremors are an example of kind of a tetany. So what's happening is the nerve impulses are bam, 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 bam. They're coming so quickly that the nerve cells don't have a chance to relax and the muscle cells don't have a chance to relax and recover from the previous kind of impulse. And that's what creates tremors or tetany. We also have neurotransmitters, and acetylcholine is the big one when it comes to your nerves communicating with your muscles. But we also have dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, right? These are all considered neurotransmitters. Dopamine has to do with things like Parkinson's disease and depression and anxiety. So does norepinephrine and serotonin, right? Have to do with depression, anxiety, and mania and that type of thing. There's no partial transmission. In other words, all of these synapses in your body that use acetylcholine or dopamine or norepinephrine or serotonin and receive impulses, they either get the whole thing or nothing at all. That's what that all or none law is. And an EEG, which is an electroencephalogram, is a visual record of the electrical wave of activity of the neurons in the brain. So if we're questioning somebody's brain activity, say to see if they're brain dead, we would do an EEG. If someone's had seizures and we're not sure why, we would do an EEG, and they just take these little electrodes, kind of looks like an EKG, and attach them. There's lots of them though. They go all over the brain to pick up on the electrical activity of all the different neurons in the brain. Okay. There's kind of a little diagram that shows you the transmission of nerve impulses. Like if you feel heat, if you feel cold, right? Pain, just simple touch or pressure. Let's see, the transmission of nerve impulses. So you have the sensory neurons, like we talked about in the beginning. They're the afferent ones. They carry messages to the brain or the spinal cord, okay? And they do it by means of these receptors, okay? And there are different kinds of receptors: exteroreceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors. The proprioceptors are the ones that help control position, balance, location, understanding spatial relationships, where your body is, where the car is, does it fit in the parking spot, etc. Exteroreceptors communicate, they receive information from the outside world, the outside environment. That's the hot, the cold, the wet, the dry, that kind of thing. And then your interoceptors, they're the ones internally that get stimuli and messages from, say, different organs in your body and send them to the brain or the spinal cord. Okay. And then when we have the other types of neurons, which are the motor neurons, the efferent, they're the ones that where the message comes from the brain, right? Or a gland that makes things move. Well, they can be broken down into somatic, which is voluntary, things you make happen; visceral, which is involuntary, like your breathing or your heart rate; and then the interneurons are the ones found in your central nervous system. They're the bridges we talked about earlier, so don't worry about that. But somatic versus visceral, okay, of which are the motor neurons, they're the ones that when you think, I want to move, you move. Right? They make movement, make things happen. But they can also be involuntary. When your control center in your brain says heartbeat, your heart beats, right? Reflexes. We talked about that already a little bit. They're automatic, they're involuntary. You don't have to think about them. They're basically, we have them to maintain balance. And they're some of them are really complicated. They do integrate into your central nervous system. The deep tendon reflexes, which are right down here, right, are the ones that we will typically test for if we're doing a neurological assessment on a patient, because that can give us valuable information as to the state of affairs in the central nervous system, the brain, believe it or not. Aging. Again, this is for everyone else, not me, right? Thought processes and ability to learn or reason should be retained. Well, that's good news. I'm not going to forget everything I ever learned. Genetics, environmental conditions, and physical changes can influence your thought processes. So in other words, if your genetics are good, you know, some people live to be 110 and still have all their faculties. Some don't. Environmental, if you worked in a coal mine, there may be damage to the brain, right? So, you know, those things all have an impact on your thought processes. As you get older, your sleep patterns change. It says here the amount of sleep needed is relatively unchanged. I would argue that because the older you get, there's multiple peer-reviewed journal research that unanimously agrees that there's sleep patterns change with less needed sleep as we age. Less REM sleep as we age. We're not making new neurons, so you know if you got what you got. So and some may die, so they may decrease. The rate of nerve transmission can decrease, and thermoregulation abilities are reduced oftentimes. You ever go to an older person's home or go in their room at a nursing home and it's 1,000 degrees? That's why. Part of it has to do with the thermoregulation, and the other part of it has to do with the fact that they're just sitting there, not moving around. So they're cold all the time. Okay. Short-term memory loss, normal, I would argue with that too, because there's plenty of information that says it is not normal to lose your train of thought. So at any rate, I'm going to kind of get rid of this. Long-term memory is usually retained. Yes. Motor skills may be affected by physiologic changes. In other words, maybe your response time may be slower than it was, when you're 60 versus when you're 40. Maybe not. Remember, nerve cells don't regenerate. So the ones that are damaged, they can't be made again. And then, I love how they throw in here conditions such as shingles may be very painful. I'm not even going to touch on this. Shingles is a reactivated, dormant herpes zoster or chickenpox, varicella virus, that runs on a nerve root, and it is very painful. But we'll talk about that later. Is the following statement true or false? An older adult may experience more falls due to lack of dexterity. If they say true, that's bad news for me. Some people, right? The aging process really is very variable, and it's unique to the person. So yes, for some people it's true, and for some people it's not. And that's the end of A&P, the nervous system. That was a lot of information, and I hope you had a blast like I did. So until next time, guys, see ya.